law, passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified on December 6, 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States and provides that neither slave nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Dedication. I would like to dedicate this book first to my mother, Anita K. Ford, who always stuck beside me physically and financially all 5 times when I was in prison, and she never judged me. To my grandmother, Rosie G., who used to tell me to be in this world, but not of the world. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but now I do. To my brothers, Bobby Ford and Jeremy Ford, thank you for being their brother's keeper in any and all situations, and their children, my nephews and nieces, who I noticed through the years watched me and encouraged me to get my life in order. Last but not least, my beautiful lady, Lucretia Kindred, whose energy I felt from the moment we met. Thank you for your patience that allowed me to figure out life on life terms. Special thanks to Joette Gray. May she continue to rest peacefully with her ancestors. Thank you for helping us close on our first home. May my dad, Robert Ford, rest peacefully with the ancestors. Love you, Dad. Chapter 1. Traumatized. Traumatized, subject to lasting shock because of an emotionally disturbing experience or physical injury. If someone is traumatized by an event or situation, it shocks or upsets them very much and may cause them psychological damage. The year was 1994. Not only my life changed, but the lives of my immediate family. Now this night was no different than any other regular night at our family's home. But this particular night, my older brother was out with a friend of the family, which was his high school buddy by the name of Brad. My mother, my little brother, and I were home with my dad as he was prepping to leave for work up until the point of discovery. I remember when Dad left for work, I was so busy into whatever I was watching on TV, I didn't even remember saying goodbye to him. All I remember was hours after my dad left, his job called. My dad worked for Union Pacific. He was a switchman at the railroad. My mom answered the phone, and I didn't think anything about it, but when my mother hung up the phone, she looked at me and said, "Your dad hasn't made it to work." She thought about it for a moment and then said, "He must be at our neighbor's house talking to him," and lost track of time. It made sense because his truck was still parked in our driveway. My mama said, "Put your shoes on. We're going across the street to Bigelow house." Bigelow was our neighbor and my dad's friend. Bigelow's father also lived with him. He had to be at least 80 years old. He was blind. I remember seeing him swinging on that swinging chair as he drank beers, and he would fall every time. And me being 13 at the time, I would laugh at him. As we walked across the street, I could see my mama getting angry because she was wondering why my dad hadn't gone to work. As we walked up to the door, I remember the living room being dark. I could see Bigelow's dad lying on the floor. I kind of laughed because I thought he was passed out drunk. I didn't notice the gash in his head because it was too dark. When we moved to the bedroom, my whole life changed. When I saw was my dad on the floor and his face lying in a pool of blood and his hands in his pockets. I could hardly gasp for air. I felt like I was dreaming. He was caught off guard. My only dad was gone. As I composed myself enough to look around, I saw Bigelow. He had the most terrifying look on his face, and there was a hole in his head. The stench of the scene filled my nose as I realized everyone was murdered, execution style. I could barely make out the words my mom was telling me because I was in complete shock. She yelled again, and I heard, "Go back outside." She also told me to pray that my father was still alive. I was 13 years old at the time, and I mustered up every bit of faith in God that I had to start praying that God would save my father. Soon after, a police officer arrived while we were standing in the yard. He approached the house and asked Mom a few questions. The police then flashed his light through the screen door, which revealed Bigelow's father laying on the floor. After the police officer went inside to observe his body, he said, "He's dead, and there's a gash in his head." Me and my mother didn't see that when we first entered the house. Even at the age of 13, I knew at that point my dad wasn't alive either. The fact that I prayed to who I knew as God at the time didn't save my dad. I didn't pray again until years later. I stopped caring. I couldn't stop seeing the image of my dad laying in the pool of blood. That image in my head caused me to say, "Fuck it all." Throughout my life, I committed all kinds of criminal acts. This was the beginning of me becoming a career criminal. Now I have to say this. I caught my first gun charge the same year before my dad was murdered. My mama told me that dad was chain smoking because he was so worried about his boys being in juvenile hall. I was so short at 13, and still is. But the juvenile facility wouldn't put me in the barracks with the boys. They put me in the girls' barracks. That's crazy. But people must understand that in the early 90s, it was banging in Little Rock era. And I'm from College Station, Arkansas. It seemed like if you mentioned that anywhere outside of my neighborhood, you had to be prepared for whatever. My dad was murdered 28 years ago, and I was 13 at the time. 7 years later, I was charged with criminal attempt to commit capital murder of a police officer, and shortly after, I was sentenced to prison at the age of 20. I know the trauma I experienced from discovering my father and his friends' murdered execution style had everything to do with my behavior. I promised myself that I'll never commit a senseless killing, but I vowed to try my best not to become a victim, and I would kill to protect my life or the lives of my brothers because I never wanted to feel this much sadness ever again. I also never wanted my mother to grieve over me like she grieved over my father's death. So whenever I felt a threat, I would strap up. I would have rather gone to prison for possession of a firearm than to be caught without one. But after my dad's murder, I can remember being so sad I wanted to die in order to stop the feeling. Now at the age of 41, I realized I should have accepted the counseling that my dad's job offered us. But at the time, my attitude was it wasn't going to bring him back, so what's the use? But one night, I can't remember if it was a dream or a vision I had, but my dad was a Marine, so he was buried in the Veterans Cemetery on Confederate and Roosevelt in Little Rock. So in my dream, or vision, I was chilling in the cemetery and my dad was leaning against the fence. Everything was quiet and bright, and he only said 3 words. He said, "Don't be sad." At the time, I needed to hear that. I continued to grieve, but I no longer wanted to die. That image in my head wouldn't go away, and to this day, I can clearly see that night, 28 years later in my mind. That alone turned to anger, and even though I didn't want to die, so the pain could ease, I lived life as if I didn't care if I lived or died. It looked that way on the surface. I believe I would do crazy things to help myself ignore the images of that night out of my mind. Even now, I still don't understand it at all.